Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to every other YouTuber who made a Xaku guide the day she came out, and who now have to remake that guide only a couple weeks later after DE decided to buff her. And also welcome to the fact that me being an absolute five-head intellectual who purposely didn't make a Xaku guide for that exact reason, so I didn't have to make two guides within such a short space of time. Not to gloat, by the way. Otherwise known as a Warframe video. After all this time that she's been out, I bet some of you thought I wasn't going to make a Xaku guide, didn't you? Well, after all the 6 or 7 years I've been playing this game, I've come to realize one of several things. The main of which being that DE are basically like that one kid that can't quite make up his mind whether he's wearing his underwear on the inside or outside of his pants that day. So now that DE have finally made all their tweaks and decisions of what they're doing with Xaku, we can finally make a guide for her, keeping in mind that this guide is going to be very beginner friendly. We're going to be summarizing everything you're going to need to know as a beginner and help brush up on things that vets may have missed initially on the first take. Also, keep in mind that the devs have mentioned that they're very likely going to be buffing her in the future. So if that's anything to go by, you could probably expect that there's going to be some more change down the line. If any of that is substantial, I will remake this guide, even if I don't want to. But if it's only minor things that are changed and nothing systemic, then I will just leave a footnote in the description of the comments down below. That way you can know what's changed. Xaku is obtained much like Gara, where her blueprint comes from completing the initial quest line on Deimos, and then her components therein come from the varying difficulties of bounty on Deimos, which I will then have a lovely little chart up on the screen to show you the general drop chances of the components. Additionally, most of her construction costs are based around the resources you get from Deimos. As a quick reminder before we go any further, these guides are very much subjective on my experience, so any builds and personal preferences I put across are just that. Personal preference. I'm sure some of you will have your own helpful input, and I always encourage a healthy discussion. So if you disagree with my advice, or if you have your own suggestions for how to play Xaku, then please put them down in the comments below, and we can have a lovely discussion about how best to play this lovely thing. Xaku, in a nutshell, is a frame that has confused the entire community since her inception for several different reasons. Those reasons ranging from whether Xaku is a he, she, it, or they, even from the developer's point of view, to what does Xaku actually bring to the table as far as abilities go. So, to summarize, Xaku, with gender confusion aside, we have to look at Xaku in the sense that she is not necessarily designed to be a useful frame. However, more so in the mindset that she is a bit of an all-rounder and a jack of all trades. To clarify on everything to know about Xaku, Xaku is much like Gauss. Even before Xaku's buff, she was very fun to play with a versatile and engaging playstyle, which, with her buff, has now only been complemented further. The only trouble you will find with her is that, much like Gauss, she can do a little bit of everything, but none of it is going to be as impactful as other frames that specialize in those mantras of play. To play Xaku, you have to rely on focusing on yourself and how to interact with everything around you. Creating a play-by-play, generally you're going to find having your one active to synergize between your other abilities will be one of the best plays you can make. Situationally casting her array of effects from your 3 to lock down areas and nullifying enemies in the process. Then, when the time is right, you can use your 2 to complement it all, as you're going to then be dishing out a crap ton of damage therein. Your 2 encouraging you to get into the deep end of an engagement, as the more enemies you can affect with your 2, the more your damage you're going to put out. The only thing to keep in mind with all of this is that it's all synergistic between each other, and you are going to be rather energy hungry through the process of this. So the more effective you are from using your abilities together, the less energy hungry you're going to be because of the length of duration your abilities will last when complemented from each other. So to help visualize this whole thing, we're going to have to explain this through visualizing the abilities themselves, starting with Xaku's passive. And this really helps to emphasize the fact that she's basically a walking menagerie of broken Lego pieces. And the passive essentially gives you a flat 25% chance to cause enemy attacks to pass directly through you. And then additionally, as part of the buff she received, also gives you a flat 25% damage reduction from area effect damages as well. This can then be buffed tremendously to a 75% reduction reduction when you have your 4th ability active. Keeping in mind, none of these stats are then affected by modding. Moving on to the actual abilities themselves, starting with Xata's Whisper, which is Xaku's 1. The way to see Xaku's 1 is it causes her to buff herself and allow every active damage she does to inflict an additional 26% void damage. And without making this too complicated, just see void damage as a very powerful damage type, as it doesn't really have anything weak to it for the most part. The buff you generate will last 35 seconds, and whilst active, will give benefits to your Grasp of Lohk and Vast Untime abilities. Now, the bonus damage modifier is affected by power strength, and when used with the correct weapon, can create a rather scary amount of bonus damage. So synergize and mod for power strength to get the most out of this. The duration is then also affected by ability duration. So at no given point should you ever have this ability not active. It's just raw damage for the sake of raw damage that can then complement everything else you cast and use. Xaku's 2 is called Grasp of Lohk, and quite literally turns you into a gun magnet. And I would say this is probably one of the more interesting abilities we've seen in quite some time. In essence, Xaku will disarm up to 6 enemies within a 15-meter radius of the cast location. And remember when I said the more you dive into combat, the better? Well, this is kind of why. The enemies affected are going to then be forced to use melee weapons and be disarmed as an extra benefit. But the disarmed weapons will then become void-infused ghosts following you around for 12 seconds, and will act as auto-firing turrets, shooting any enemy that walks within 8 meters. These guns deal a base of 50 void damage, but then that gets multiplied by your power strength and whatever level the enemy is. So because of that, this ability will always scale to meet the level requirements of the mission you're in. Additionally, this can also be cast on unarmed or melee enemies, and will, instead of generating a weapon visual, it will then generate an orb that shoots lasers instead. Now, the duration of the guns is affected by ability duration, and the shoot distance of said guns is affected by, as well as also the disarm radius is affected by range. And the thing to realize about range is the amount of range you build for will also dictate the amount of guns you get. The amount of guns you can get is at the moment capped at about 12 to 14. However, it's not likely that you're ever going to get that amount. So you need to balance yourself between power strength and range to make the most use of your 2. Ability number 3, and this is where a lot of the complexity can lie with Xaku, it's called The Lost. No, don't worry, this isn't a terrible mid-2000s TV show. This is in fact Xaku's 3, and is in fact where a lot of your ability synergy will come from. Holding this ability will cause one of 3 selected abilities to be cast. This ability can then be cycled through by tapping said ability button. The 3 abilities that you're going to be able to cycle through are the following, starting with Accuse. Accuse will cause up to 8 enemies in an area of 11 meters that Xaku aims at to be corrupted by void energy for 16 seconds, stunning them and then forcing them to shoot their allies. See, this is kind of like a pseudo radiation proc, as it were. Modding for power strength will increase the overall amount of enemies that can be affected, and this is honestly where some of the better crowd control can come in. Gaze is the second of these 3 abilities, and Gaze will freeze an enemy within 25 meters of where Xaku aims. Now, the enemy that is affected will then be surrounded by a Japanese schoolgirl's worst nightmare: tentacles. I've seen enough hentai to know where this is going. Anyway, once entrapped, the enemy are going to be immune to damage for 14 seconds. However, while captive, the enemy will become a pylon of a debuffing aura. That will cause enemies that come within 8 meters of this tentacle-infused enemy to be weakened, having their shields and armor reduced by 50%. Additionally, you can have up to 2 enemies influenced by tentacles at one given time. Furthermore, modding for 200% power strength will increase the potency of this armor and shield reduction cap to 100% reduction. So in essence, Xaku can turn into a complete shield and armor stripping beast with the right mindset, opening up for vulnerability and absolute raw destruction for your team. Your third and final of these rotatable abilities is Deny. Deny discharges a wave of void energy in a ray towards her aiming reticle and will travel up to 25 meters. Deny will inflict 4,000 void damage and cause affected enemies to be lifted in a time freeze for 14 seconds, acting as a high damage and crowd control utility. Additionally, this damage can be amplified based on the number of void replicas your 2 generates, again, complementing your need to be active and engaging in combat as much as possible. This can become the Kamehameha of all abilities, to even rival that of Wisps. Now for your fourth and ultimate ability, the Vast Untime is your ultimate and is probably one of the goofiest abilities I've ever seen. Xaku will explode in a 25-meter radius, dealing 1,200 damage to enemies within range, also causing those enemies to become 50% more vulnerable to void damage, so really helping to emphasize your aforementioned abilities and the synergy therein. Additionally, enemies affected, should they survive, will have a 25 reduction in speed. And once having exploded, you become a spooky, scary skeleton. In this mode, your passive buffs up to now take 75% less AoE damage and gives you a 75% chance to have damage pass through you. And additionally, allows you to move faster as an extra little benefit. And as an extra little benefit, being in this mode will pause the duration of all your other abilities, meaning whatever duration your regular abilities will then have the additional time of however long your untime lasts for. Once untime wears off, then the counter for your regular abilities will begin as per the normal. This mode will last for 25 seconds, or until you tap your ability again to reform. The best way I could suggest using this is as a, hey, that's a lot of baddies, let's explode on them kind of mode, when you know there's going to be a long fight and with the possibility of death. This can act as your survivability, as well as also the time where you want to make sure the enemies around you are dead and vulnerable to all your previous casts to complement all your damage. See it as a Super Saiyan mode that can make you deal a lot of damage, allow your abilities to exceed their regular duration, and something that should be lined up so that you can allow all your other abilities to excel. And should the energy allow it, something you should generally have active as much as possible. So what does this mean when we bring it all together? Xaku is a frame that is basically a prisoner to having all her abilities active at once. Realistically, the way to play her is you want to have your 4 active at any given point. Whenever you cast an ability, to make sure it lasts as long as possible, you then cast your Vast Untime afterwards. The longer you have your Vast Untime active, the more survivability you have, the longer your other abilities will last, and when synergized together, you can have an array of abilities that will destroy even level 175 bombards here. The order that I would always recommend doing this is cast an ability first, then cast Vast Untime to make it last as long as possible. If energy allows, make sure you always have your 1 active. Your 1 has a large amount of duration by default, so even when your other abilities wear off, chances are your 1 will still be going. But when used in the correct order and in the right situation, you're going to be dealing a lot of damage whilst taking very little of it. And finally, very quickly, as always, a lovely little build segment. As always though, please do keep in mind that these build segments are entirely subjective. The builds I'm demonstrating are merely what have worked for me, and I always encourage innovation and testing of your own builds. Find what works for you and realize what I show is just what worked for me. Starting with a very good generalized build. Now, it's not often that I recommend an aura mod, but Energy Siphon is going to be very useful for you here because you are generally a very energy hungry frame. But as always, choose your aura mod based on your preference. Then from there in, with this build, we're focusing a lot on power strength. We're going to be using this build to strip the armor's enemy and deal a lot of raw damage from our abilities by themselves, with our 2 dealing most of the damage therein. So with this build, we have our survivability mods, which are adaptation and vitality. Anytime the survivability mods are present, it's always about what you would rather use and what you have available. I personally use vitality and adaptation because it's what I have available, but for most people, it'd probably be either vitality or steel fiber or whatever you feel comfortable with. Then we have a little bit of range from stretch and reach that allows our guns to be able to hit from a nice distance away without having to get right up close to people. Then we have enough duration to make sure that the abilities by themselves can last long enough to then be complemented by the duration of your untime. And then from there in, Streamline is basically the only efficiency mod we can put in here. Xaku's quite energy hungry, so even with Streamline and Fleeting, you'd kind of lose too much of one thing to make them worth using. So we kind of found that Streamline is probably the best thing to use here, especially if you're only going with 2 or 3 former. Generally speaking, most optimal builds can be obtained very easily with 2 or 3 former, depending on what mastery level you are. And to sort of go with a more supportive role, this build doesn't necessarily rely so much on self-play as opposed to supporting. This is going to be where you control an area, cause enemies to fight each other with your 3. And with this build, because you have so much range, you're going to generate a lot of guns from your 2. And that, in theory, can then make up for the lack of power strength. So with this build, you're going to rely around using your 3, your 2, and your 1 and your 4 aren't necessarily going to be as impactful, but they'll still be needed to complement the other abilities you'll be using. Relying much more heavily on a bit more range with overextended being put in there, we've lost a little bit of survivability, only using 1 survivability mod with this, but therein we have much more control, so it's less likely we're to take damage. And realistically, at that point, there's not really much that's been changed here. We've just made a much bigger preface towards range. And as always, a new player incentivized build. This is one that will be orientated around being accessible, especially to someone who's very new to the game. There's no difficulty with this. It's just as much of the foundations as possible. We've got streamline, continuity, flow, and intensify to help with the baseline modding. And then just because I feel like duration is probably a little bit more influential at the early levels, we've gone for Augur Message, which is obtained from the Plains of Eidolon, and then we have Vitality and Steel Fiber to act as our survivability. So that's the Xaku guide, a bit more of an involved guide than we're used to in the past, but there's a lot to learn about Xaku that's very interesting. And I honestly see, now that Xaku's getting her buffs, that Xaku's very likely going to be a frame that we're going to see a lot more of. And although we are suffering with the issue of having a large amount of frames and a very saturated amount of frames in the game, I think this is giving us more options to fine-tune what we personally feel is enjoyable for us. So, if you have enjoyed this video, please leave a like, maybe subscribe, and leave a comment down below about how you feel about Xaku in her current state. And on that note as well, I would like to point out that we are almost done with all of the frame guides at this stage. So at this point, we're kind of going to be going back and reworking some and updating them to the modern standard. So if you would like to see any of the reworks done first, or which frames you'd like to see have a reworked guide made first, please leave that as a comment down below as well. So thank you very much for watching. I'll see you all in the next video, or maybe drop by our Twitch channel. Ta-ra.